how many times can I say secondary content? How many different ways can I try and find a way to make secondary content? Well, here's another attempt as I am going to try my best to review timeline of the history of WCW 1989 as told by Jim Cornette. Now, this series was a series produced by Sean Oliver, the head of Kayfabe Commentaries, and they have been archiving their footage on their YouTube channel recently, and I've loved every single second of it, rewatching some of my favorites from the Kayfabe Commentaries archives, because I used to watch these DVDs all the time. I, as you guys know, am somewhat of a wrestling historian, or like to think of myself as one, and I love breaking down and looking back at wrestling history and hearing the stories told from those who inhabited that time and could tell those stories in the most eloquent manners and the best way possible for us the wrestling fans to understand what it was like to be an employee of WCW at the time. And though the disarray was not as bad as it would get, it started optimistic and it ended setting the stage for what would have been the disarray that would plague the company until Eric Bischoff started changing WCW in the mid 1990s. So I'm going to go over some of the good and we're going to touch on the bad, but I suggest anyone who is a fan of wrestling history to go back and watch this episode or this series from WCW from Kayfabe Commentaries. I have it linked in the description below. Go back and watch it because you will enjoy it if you're a fan of this type of thing. In my opinion, WCW in 1989 was still recovering from the purchase of Turner Broadcasting, WCW purchasing Turner Broadcasting, and, well, the new appointment of top executive Jim Herd and Jack Petrick. Jack Petrick was the head of WCW, the department that WCW was under, and Jim Herd was named the head of WCW from Jack Petrick, which I think was a mistake, but we'll get to that at the end. Let's start with the bad and get that out of the way, then segue into the good, because the bad was a lot. Most of the bad was revolving around the hiring of those in charge. Jim Herd, like I said, we'll get to that in a second. The Iron Sheik, George Scott, the Dynamic Dudes, and I'm sure that if I actually went through it, I could probably find a lot to break down and go through. In my opinion, Jim Crockett being appointed as head booker, Dusty Rhodes being fired and kept on in the company, and the fact of the matter is, the reason why Jim Crockett should not have been put on as booker is because Crockett did not know what was going on at the time, and it's clear based on the fact that the first thing he wanted to do was take away one of the top angles, and one of the top angles was the original Midnight versus the Midnight. For those who may not be aware, Randy Rose, Norville Austin, and Dennis Condrey were the original Midnights in Continental, and prior to the advent of the new Midnight Express with Dennis Condrey and Bobby Eaton and Jim Cornette, they had the trio of Norvell, Randy, and Dennis Condrey. But then, after a while, Dennis left the business, and it became Stan Lane and Bobby Eaton. But then, in the late 1980s, Dennis Condrey and Randy Rose started teaming up again in AWA under the management services of Paul E. Dangerously. And that let and it was late 1989 or late 1988 when Cornette went to Dusty Rhodes and said that we need somebody new to work with because they were floundering after Arn and Tully left for WWE. So Cornette asked Dusty to bring in the original Midnights with Paul Lee. And if you have never seen the debut of the original Midnights in World Championship Wrestling, then it is an angle that you need to see because it is unlike anything you have seen before, and it is the embodiment of the 1980s. And I think one of my favorite angles, next to of course the stuff in Memphis, but that's for another video. But in my opinion, if Crockett saw how hot that angle was and the surprise and the shock and awe that it produced from the fan base at the time when it first started in late 1988, then Crockett would have kept the angle going. And he would have been the maintenance guy that he said he was going to be and just kept maintain the status quo. But he did not because he did not like Randy Rose. And he stepped on the toes of the angle, nipping it in the butt and stopping it before it got going. That's what Cornette was doing. And again, I'm not defending Jim Cornette. I'm not backing up Jim Cornette. I'm saying I've seen the angle personally. I saw the video of it. And I think if Crockett knew how hot it was when it ended or when it started and where it was going and let Cornette explain what the angle was going to accomplish, then the fact of the matter is Crockett would have let it go because he would have known it would have produced money. And he would have because he trusted Corny. He trusted Bobby and Stan for the money that he made him. But a lot of other stuff was going on at the time, and it's pretty obvious Crockett's mind wasn't where it was when he was running the show. Iron Sheik, I mean, it was 1989. The Sheik was past his prime, and he shouldn't have been anywhere near a wrestling ring. Flair, I mean, that's about it. You know, that's about it. I do also think that to a degree they were still feeling the effects of what happened at the end. What I mean is that they were still feeling the effects of having talent coming in and just having no idea what to do. Like they did not have a clear direct they did not have a clear direction like they did before the sale and before Arn and Tully left. Dusty was never able to reestablish a clear direction. And even though in my opinion I would have loved to see what would have happened if Eddie Gilbert fought Ric Flair in a feud, having Ricky Steamboat return at the first Clash of Champions in 1989 was one of the first good things and a hot way to get things going for WCW in 1989 because Ricky Steamboat had not been within the ranks of the company in 4 years. So the idea that Ricky Steamboat returned left fans salivating, and not just fans but wrestlers salivating. And Cornette would say that later on, how excited they were to see Ricky Steamboat back and having him fight Ric Flair for the NWA World Championship was something that left everybody salivating, except of course George Scott, because George Scott refused to promote the match at Clash of Champions because it was the match that they were promoting on the house shows, and he did not want he did not want the fact that they were giving it away on free television to affect the business that they were going to do on house shows with Rick Steamboat and Ric Flair on the house shows, because George Scott was still in the mindset of the 1970s that you need to bring the people to the arenas and the ratings don't matter, because George Scott was under the guise of pre-national expansion, not post-national expansion. He had been working with Vince the last couple of years and not in charge at the helm of a company. He was not in the position that he was in 1973 when he took over creative of Crockett Promotions the first time. So much like Bill Watts, when Bill Watts took over in 1992, I think George Scott was a little overmatched and a little overwhelmed and out of his element. In my opinion, I think what would have been best for WCW early on was for Dusty to step back and Jim Crockett to step in with Dusty as his co-booker, where Crockett could do maintenance, Dusty can handle the small details, or the big picture. Crockett could do maintenance, sort of like the JJ Dusty arrangement that they had, but it killed creative even more when JJ left. Dusty left. The Road Warriors left. Barry Windham, I believe, would end up leaving. Oh no, Barry Windham rejoined the company. I forgot. Let me rephrase that. But floundering of the dynamic dudes, Iron Sheik, and I could probably lose track with how many bad things I could talk about. But let's get to the good things, because one of the good things was the return of Ricky Steamboat and the trilogy that Ricky Steamboat and Ric Flair had. That even though the match on the Clash of Champions at the Superdome underwhelmed because of George Scott not promoting the event on television because he didn't want it to affect the house shows, in the end, the trilogy was still, in my opinion, one of, if not the greatest trilogy of matches in wrestling history. And it showed that WCW had the better in ring product than WWE did at the time. WWE was just a bit more stable than WCW. And I think that this story was told as best it could be, with better than anybody, because of Cornette's detail and the breaking down that and the fact that Cornette at this time joined the creative team, taking Eddie, uh, assuming the position in the creative team after Flair took over the creative spot. But Flair moved from feuding with Ricky Steamboat in the greatest trilogy, in my opinion, of that era, into a knockdown, drag him out feud of the year candidate with Terry Funk. And that's what led to Ric Flair becoming the Wrestler of the Year in 1989. Because not only was Ric Flair responsible for controlling the company, but he legitimately put WCW on his back. He legitimately put WCW on his back and carried the company from start to finish, basically saying, look, look, I can handle it. I can handle it. The 2 out of 3 falls match at Clash of Champions, the match that George Scott did not promote, won WCW their first ever Wrestling Observer Match of the Year award. Ricky Steamboat versus Ric Flair, 2 out of 3 falls match, New Orleans, the second match in the series. The first match was at Chi-Town Rumble. It was Clash of the Champions, New Orleans, Superdome, April 2nd. Ric Flair, Ricky Steamboat, 2 out of 3 falls. The match that George Scott did not promote and ended up costing him his job, won the Observer's Wrestling of the Year award. And not only that, but Ric Flair won the PWI Wrestler of the Year as well. Terry Funk won the Best on Interviews. Ric Flair, Ricky Steamboat at Wrestle War, which was the finale of the series. So one match won the Wrestling Observer Match of the Year. The other match won the PWI Match of the Year. That should tell you how amazing that trilogy was. And then you go in, Feud of the Year was Terry Funk versus Ric Flair by PWI. It just tells you the time. It just tells you the time. It shows the momentum that WCW had. It just shows the momentum that WCW had. And, you're going to tell me that, and for Wrestling Observer, Ric Flair, Terry Funk, it's the same thing. Ric Flair, Terry Funk, Ricky Steamboat, Ric Flair, two best things that happened in WCW during that time. Two of the best things that happened in 1989. And if that was where the year ended, if that is how the year ended, then 1989 would be looked at as one of the best years in WCW history. And one of the best years in wrestling history, in my opinion. But unfortunately, that's not how it is. You know, bar none, bar none, Ric Flair would main event every single year. I mean, every single pay per view that WCW had at that time. But you cannot not talk about the inaugural Halloween Havoc in 1989, the cage match with Terry Funk, Great Muta, Ric Flair, and Sting, and the electrified steel cage. That if they would have just had it in the steel cage, then that would have been enough. But again, if I nitpick through and try and find the bad, then we would end up ignoring the good. Chi-Town Rumble, Wrestle War, Clash of Champions in New Orleans, Great American Bash, from January to the July, everything was hitting on all cylinders. But by the end of the year, all that momentum was gone. And in my opinion, a lot of it revolves around the appointment of Jim Herd. And I'm not just saying this to crap on Jim Herd. I'm saying this because, in my opinion, the way WCW was structured when Eric Bischoff took over, if that was how it was structured in 1989, then the fact of the matter is WCW in 1989 would have had a shit ton of momentum going into 1990. And Cornette proves it, but being snake bitten in 1990 being snake bitten in 1990 when Sting got injured severely with his knee injury, it changed things for the worse. That aside, that wasn't because of the executives or anybody in charge. That aside, it just shows how things would have been, in my opinion. You take out Halloween Havoc, you take out Starcade, and you cut it off at the Great American Bash. The momentum that WCW had at the time was immeasurable, in my opinion. And the fact of the matter is, I think if the structure was a little bit better, a little bit more cohesive, then the fact of the matter is, it would have been better off in every stretch of the imagination. Because Cornette and Paulie tore down the house, figuratively and literally, defying expectations in the tuxedo match at Great American Bash. Sting and Muta, Luger and Ricky Steamboat, War Games with the Road Warriors, Midnight Express, Dr. Death, Steve Williams, Jimmy Garvin, Terry Gordy, Michael Hayes, and the Samoan SWAT team. Gary Hart was one of the top heels in WCW at the time and was living up to his expectations and living up to his potential that he had, living up to the potential that everybody knew he always had. Butch Reed and Ron Simmons strengthened the tag team division. Brian Pillman was finding his footing. And that's a conversation for 1990. You had talent in droves in WCW at the time, but the fact of the matter is, the corporate structure wasn't there. I will even say that the main event of Halloween Havoc 1989 was not bad. It just started off on the wrong foot and went in the wrong direction from the very start. And Starcade was the peak, and it went downhill from there. If the corporate structure was a little bit better, if Jack Petrick had somebody in charge that wasn't Jim Herd, that was under the WCW banner, like Brad Siegel would have with JJ in 2000, then it would have been better off for WCW, because you wouldn't have had someone who wanted to think that they knew professional wrestling stating their opinions and putting over their ideas and not taking too kindly to nobody accepting their ideas. I'm not defending Jim Herd's ideas. Jim Herd's ideas were shit. But the fact of the matter is, I think his point of view was, nobody's agreeing with me, nobody's understanding my point of view, nobody's taking my thoughts into consideration, and they're just shitting on everything I say. So I don't want to be here to begin with. I'm just going to make them leave and get people in power that want to do what I want to do because I'm the person in charge. And the fact of the matter is, I think that's one of the main reasons for the momentum stunting with WCW. No matter every best effort that Ric Flair had and the momentum that the shows had going into 1990, everything crapped out by the end because of the corporate structure. That if the corporate structure was in a different shape and a different position and put in a different direction, the WCW would have been in a better place in 1990 had things been a little bit different. In my opinion, I think that, well, why stunt the momentum of Terry Funk? Why stunt the momentum of Terry Funk? You could have had him working with Sting. You could have had Flair working with Muta. You could have kept the Gary Hart thing going and had Gary Hart's personal vendetta against Ric Flair. A personal vendetta against Ric Flair. You could have did the old booking trope of having the guy leave and then come back under an assumed name. You could have had Gary Hart bring in one of his foreign menaces. And Gary Hart moved Gary Hart into the main crux of the feud. But they went with what they went with in 1988, and then they went back to it in 1989, and then they went back to it in 1990. They went to those Sting and Flair well one too many times, in my opinion, because that's where stability was. And that's the only place they found stability, because by the end of 1989, Ricky Steamboat was gone from WCW. The tag team division was getting established, but the Road Warriors had been gone. Midnight Express had been crapped on. The Samoan SWAT team was still being developed. But the fact of the matter is, everything was changing in WCW, and everything would have been different if the corporate structure was just a little bit more solidified, in my opinion. But this has been my review of WCW's timeline, the history of This has been my DVD review of Kayfabe Commentaries, timeline, the history of WCW, 1989, as told by Jim Cornette. Again, if you want to listen to this, if you want to watch this, I will put a link to the video in the description below. And if you want to see the video of the original Midnight debuting and attacking the Midnight Express, and you tell me if you think that angle was straight fire and would have been something that you would have watched and you would have enjoyed, let me know down in the comment section below. I will attach that down in the description as well. And also let me know let me know by interacting with this video any way you want, that you want to see more videos like this, because again, this was just an experiment for some secondary content. But either way, this is me signing off. I will see you in the next video.